In this mini presentation, I want to share some insights with you about the critical degrees in astrology. There are actually many types of critical degrees, but there's two in particular that should be understood. Different interpretations of astrology and so forth will include other degrees than 0 and 29. So briefly, a cycle, or which is symbolized by a circle or a sphere, can be understood as a 360-degree wheel, just like a circle, and the degree has 60 minutes and a minute has 60 seconds. So we see the circle of the zodiac, for example, as 360-degree circle divided by 12, each segment equaling 30 degrees. So we have 12 30-degree segments for each sign of the zodiac. So when we have a planet at 0 degrees or 29, they can be understood to be holding the alpha and the omega position. And it sounds a bit dire, but it's not, but it is significant, and it does have an influence for sure. Especially, this is true if it's in your natal chart. If you have a planet at 0 degrees or 29 in your natal chart, it plays an important role, but it's also true in other forms of cycles for us collectively or individually. So if there's a planet currently at 29 degrees, there's a bit of overcoming. All depends on how it influences your chart for you personally. But as I said, it could apply to larger nations or cities or companies, etc., how the 0 or 29 plays a role. So the 0 Aries, by the way, because Aries is the first sign of the zodiac, would be called the alpha degree of the entire zodiac, and 29 Pisces, which is the last degree of the entire zodiac, would be the omega of the zodiac. But 0 and 29 degrees of any sign is significant. So keep that in mind if you happen to see any planets or angles, or even house cusps for that matter, although they're less important. But if you do in fact see a planet or angle at 0 or 29 degrees, you know there's something significant about that. And basically, the 0 degrees represents the beginning, like the baby, where what's critical is this example of the baby learning to walk is that it's not on stable legs yet. It will walk, the child will walk, but there is this critical time period during which the standing and balancing and being strong enough to do that is there versus walking, etc. So it's just that time period in every person's life, and of course in a child's life, when they're moving from not crawling and then learning to walk. So that's very much 0 degrees. The beginning, it could be illustrated in a lot of different ways, like learning to ride a bicycle or anything that you're new at. All right, so it can be understood as a green or baby-like beginner point in your chart. And what's critical is that you're fresh. There may be some beginner's luck going on there, though, by the way, so it's worth considering. The 29th degree is that much more serious in that it's sort of like the final exam, testing. And people who have planets or angles at the 29th degree can, at various periods of their life at least, experience sort of an aloneness, a solitary sense that they have to do this and there's nobody to help them. So if they hold, if your sun was at 29 degrees, or if the north node was at 29 degrees, or angles in your chart, they would be lifetime themes. Or even a planet, even Mercury, say, was at 29 degrees, it would be an ongoing process of having to overcome whatever that planet in that sign symbolizes. And yes, you could add aspects and so forth, but basically the planet in the sign at that degree, or the angle, or a node, for example, of the moon, will all play a very important role throughout your life. So it becomes a significant theme of recognition in looking at your chart and gaining a deeper understanding of who you are and what represents your life lessons, and where you're at in your journey is partly in terms of the transiting or progression aspects. Sometimes they'll show up in a return chart, which is another story. I'm going to leave that one alone for now. But the main point is that in various techniques of prediction, 29 degrees can show up, and it can be illustrated as just, measuring a certain period of time during which, you're going to go through this testing period. You're going to not have a lot of people to rely on. You're going to have to do it yourself, etc. Okay, so that's can really help a lot when you know that. Then, by being aware that you can't rely on anybody else and you have to pass the exam yourself, then you get stronger in a positive sense. You don't rely on what's not there. So now, coming soon in February, there will be a very unique and rare conjunction of two planets at 29 degrees. It's not like it never occurs, because especially a far planet sits at a certain point for a long time, so the faster moving planets can come along and conjunct that planet more easily, especially the moon, for example, which goes through a sign every 2.5 days. But the main point is, here in mid-February, February 13th to be exact, 2019, we're going to have a Mars conjunct Uranus in Aries at the critical 29th degree of the first sign of the zodiac. And there basically is the chart which shows it. That's the Mars and Uranus at 2911, February the 13th. This chart is illustrating all the house cusps at that degree, but we won't go into that right now. In other presentations, I explain more about those. But for now, as it is, we have a 29th degree. It's not going to last long, only basically that day, because of the fact that Mars is moving fairly quickly. So it will just come along and be active in that moment. But it does, if you happen to have planets or angles in your chart at those degrees, it will trigger them and will activate something. Now, it doesn't mean anything necessarily bad. Actually, the activation could just be important, meaningful, noticeable. These words can apply very well. So it doesn't mean that it's dire or dramatic or absolute emergencies per se by any means. But once again, activating and so forth are a good way of looking at it. So if you have planets at 29 degree in your chart, you should probably feel some kind of activation on that day specifically, but leading up to it and a bit thereafter. I'm using this as purely, this image as purely as an example of what can be described as Mars Uranus in Aries, the martial sign. I just basically referring to it as battleships. But it's not a strict prediction here. It just gives you an idea that the critical degree itself is one of testing. But when you bring two together, and especially Mars and Uranus, very yang, very forceful, very assertive, and in the sign of Aries, you get a sense, wow, that's a good example. We can refer to it as, a battleship moment. So that's all I wanted to really say about the critical degrees. There is much more to be said. It's quite a lengthy discussion to go into, and it's really interesting and exciting to begin to study into the degrees in astrology. But just basically, you can quickly look at your own chart if you have one and decipher, do I have planets at 0 to 29? And if I do, you'll quickly recognize that 0 is where you're beginning, and green, and should give yourself, more of a break. Be patient with your ability to, really produce results at the level at which you might like. But if you have one at 29, you have to be more persevering. You have to, continue, overcome, don't quit, keep going kind of thing, and be very patient also with the overcoming process, because it really is, especially if in your natal chart, a lifetime theme of overcoming. So that can be difficult, and it's considered often a degree of loneliness, but it need not necessarily be that. But a better word than loneliness is solitude, or independence would probably be the best one in the most empowering sense. So there you go, a little sneak peek at 29 degrees, and specifically also for some particular aspect that's coming up soon, Mars Uranus in Aries.